her species. Now she's chosen me to rebuild it. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The old warning light blinked faintly on Derek Sloan's console, a soft amber pulse against the cold blue of deep space. He leaned back in his chair, boots kicked onto the edge of the navigation panel, and stared at it without much interest. It was probably a decaying comm buoy, a leftover ping from a ship long gone. Most of them were. The galaxy had become cluttered with the leftovers of war and colonization, drifting arcs, mined-out husks or weapons platforms on standby since before he was born. Still, he needed salvage credits, and a derelict this deep into the Per Se wreck zone could mean solid payoff. The ID tag caught his eye. Velary Biogene Arc Orion Nest. That name tugged at something. Velary. A ghost of a war whispered through history books. A race thought extinct after they refused to surrender their biogenetic technologies. It had been a political nightmare, followed by orbital bombardment and the kind of silence that told you everything you needed to know. If this was legit and unstripped, he might be looking at a forgotten treasure trove. And if it was, well, it wasn't like anyone would notice one more junker ship going quiet. It took him 17 hours to dock. The Ark spun slowly, tumbling on a lazy axis, gravity long since lost. The hull was scorched in places, pitted with old railgun strikes and micrometeor impacts, but the maglock clamp still accepted his ship's handshake. That was his first sign something wasn't right. Ships this dead didn't talk back. Ships suited up, ran through the usual power checks, and carried a compressed Atmo emergency case with him in case of sudden seal breach. He wasn't afraid. This wasn't his first deep dive, but something about the silence of the place pressed on him the moment he stepped inside. Not a sound, not even the usual hiss of air recycling, just the faint hum of his own respirator. He shined a beam down the corridor and saw rows of control consoles covered in dust. Long dead screens, empty cryopods, dried blood on the wall near the medical bay, the kind of things that told stories you didn't want to hear out loud. Derek kept moving, trying not to think about what those last days had looked like. He wasn't here to mourn, he was here for salvage. But then a console flickered to life behind him, a low chime like a heartbeat coming back from flatline. His head snapped around, weapon half raised. Nothing moved. No sound followed, just a small blinking line on a navigation screen, a green dot, and a set of coordinates guiding him deeper into the ship. He wasn't an idiot. That kind of sudden interface wasn't a coincidence. Someone or something was still here. Maybe an AI, maybe a trap, but he wasn't about to run. Instead, he followed. The corridors grew cleaner the deeper he went, still old but without the grime of neglect. Light strips glowed faintly overhead, powered by something other than the main core. He reached a set of sealed biolab doors. They hissed open at his presence. Inside, the air shimmered. Climate control, real gravity, and warmth. It felt like stepping into a living heartbeat after being dead cold outside. His helmet sensors flared, organic life detected, heat signature, humanoid, female. He turned gun drawn, but froze the moment he saw her. She stood near a cryotank, backlit by the glowing fluid inside. She was tall, not in a towering way, but in the way dancers were tall, long-legged, and powerful. Her skin was dark violet, smooth and glossy with bioluminescent freckles that flickered like tiny stars across her shoulders and collarbone. Her hair, wild and black, spilled around her face and curled in ways that seemed untamed by gravity. And her eyes, bright crystalline, almost too blue, locked onto him with the focus of a predator. "You're not a clone," she said, voice rich but low. "You're alive. Unmodified, human. That's unexpected." He kept the weapon raised but not aimed. "You're Velary." Her head tilted the motion, oddly animalistic. Then her long tail, a powerful, sinuous thing, twitched behind her like a curious cat. "Leenora, I was supposed to be the matron of the next generation, but there were no children left to raise, so I slept." She stepped closer, nostrils flaring slightly. "You came here alone. Salvage tech freelance, he watched her carefully. If you're the last, what are you still doing here? Waiting, she replied, for someone compatible. The word hit him harder than it should have. Compatible with what? She blinked with me. Then, without hesitation, she raised a small scanning device and pointed it at his chest. A burst of light passed through him, followed by a soft series of beeps. She looked down at the readout and something like a smirk crossed her face. Fertile, unmodified, healthy, and attractive. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. You're serious? Leenora nodded slowly. I wasn't awake until the genetic database was triggered. The Ark sensed your proximity and woke me. I assumed the humans had sent a researcher, but you're alone and unsupervised. That gives me certain freedoms. He lowered his gun. Hold on. You're telling me your entire species left you in stasis, hoping someone would show up and repopulate? No, she said gently. They left me to carry our legacy forward by any means necessary. I choose how and who. She stepped closer. Her hand reached up and touched the side of his helmet. Smooth, slow, not aggressive. I could have forced this process, but I won't. Velary reproduction is intimate, spiritual. It must be mutual. Derek stared at her, stunned not by her forwardness, but by the strange mixture of warmth and calculation in her. She didn't look desperate. She looked certain. You don't even know me, he said. I will, she replied. We have time, but know this, if you leave, I will sleep again, and everything in this ark will decay. Our songs, our science, our children, gone, forever. I'm not begging, I'm offering. The silence between them stretched long. Derek knew this wasn't just about saving a race. It was about choosing to be part of something bigger than himself, part of a future that no one else could offer him. Still, he needed to know more. About her, about the Ark, about the risks, and why, even now, a part of him felt like the door behind him had quietly locked itself shut the moment she touched his helmet. Derek stood still long after Leenora had pulled her hand away. There was something ancient in the stillness of the Ark, as if time itself had frozen to await his decision. The hum of nearby systems seemed too quiet, the air too warm. Her offer hung in the space between them, not romanticized, not desperate, just real. He wasn't stupid enough to pretend he understood everything, but he knew this much. She wasn't bluffing. She could have overpowered him. She could have activated restraints or some kind of mind control tech. Instead, she gave him room to breathe and space to choose. That meant something. He slowly unsealed his helmet and pulled it off, the recycled air in the biolab thick but breathable. Her eyes lit up the moment she saw his face. She didn't smile exactly. It was subtler than that, a twitch in the corners of her mouth, a tilt of her head, something curious and quietly pleased. I'm not saying yes, he said calmly, setting the helmet down beside the empty terminal. But I'm not running either. That's more than most gave us, she replied softly, crossing her arms. The last humans we encountered didn't stop to talk. I read about the war, he said, stepping further into the chamber. Never made sense. Your people never invaded. You just refused to share your bioengineering tech. Knowledge is dangerous in the wrong hands, she murmured, tapping the surface of the cryotank beside her. We made life, healed broken genes, altered instincts. For centuries we believed we were helping, then someone decided it was too powerful to trust us. Derek didn't argue. History was written by survivors, and his side had survived by annihilating theirs. There was no pride in that. He looked around the biolab more closely, now rows of suspended nutrient cradles, low-power stasis fields flickering under the floor, even a still-functioning DNA sequencer in the corner. This place wasn't a military base. It was a nursery, a scientific temple, a future that had been choked off mid-sentence. How many embryos survived? He asked, already walking toward the sequencing array. 37, she replied, but without my genetic structure to guide the formation process, they'll decay within a decade. I was designed as the keystone to the next generation, and you think I'm compatible? You are, she said with certainty. Your immune system, brainwave frequencies, hormonal responses, they all sync within acceptable margins. More importantly, your instincts lean toward empathy rather than dominance. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. That's the weirdest compliment I've ever gotten. Would you prefer I comment on your jawline instead? Not opposed to it, he muttered, but there was a flicker of a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. She was sharp, not just brilliant, but witty and quick with her words in a way that didn't feel rehearsed. She wasn't manipulating him. She was evaluating him. You don't have to decide now, she said, her voice lowering a notch. But if you stay, there's work to be done. The ship's core is failing. Systems are fragmenting. If I power up full restoration protocols, we lose life support in other zones. It's a balance I can't maintain alone. Derek nodded. This he understood. A dying ship. A fragile structure held together by backup wiring and automated systems fighting entropy. He moved toward the console and began tapping into the engineering readout. The interface was mostly intact, text symbols adapted for multilingual reading, though many were in ancient Velary script. Still, diagnostics were diagnostics, and he could follow the power flow well enough. There was a trifusion energy array connected to a bioreactor, both strained beyond ideal range. The oxygen farm was flickering, water reclamation was barely functional, and the ship's AI core had been offline for decades, likely corrupted or purged. It would take days to reroute systems, patch power relays, and get the life support stabilized, but it wasn't impossible, and he wasn't useless. "You've got tools?" he asked, already scanning the equipment racks. "In storage," she answered, motioning to a hidden alcove behind a wall panel. "Everything I couldn't risk leaving in open areas during the last invasion attempt." Derek retrieved a toolkit the size of a backpack, compact but dense with modular gear. He crouched by the primary relay panel and began working, unscrewing rusted seals and inspecting the layered wiring beneath. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she knelt beside him and watched, asking questions without sounding condescending. He appreciated that. Too many people in the salvage business treated him like a glorified junkyard rat, but she saw value in what he was doing, not just the results. "I spent most of my training learning how to monitor gene sequencing," she said, handing him a fiber optic splice cable. "I've never repaired a reactor. My sisters would have." Derek looked up. "You had a big family." 3 blood sisters, 8 half-sisters. My people were grown in clusters designed for symbiotic learning. We weren't built to survive alone." Her voice softened again, the words nearly breaking as she said, "But I am." He didn't offer cheap sympathy. Instead, he nodded once, then pointed at the relay. "Hold this in place. We're going to reroute the current so the AI cluster gets a soft boot. If we're lucky, we can extract some archived data before it fully collapses." She moved instantly, finger steady, no hesitation. As they worked, the lab lights flickered brighter, the air circulation kicking into higher gear. System by system, they brought parts of the Ark back to life, patching what they could and isolating what they couldn't. Hours passed, but it felt like minutes. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was mechanical, focused, necessary. But even so, the distance between them began to shrink. Every nod of approval from her, every quiet word of trust he earned, built something fragile but growing. By the time he shut the panel and wiped sweat from his brow, he realized she was watching him again. Not scanning him, not measuring, just watching. Her eyes weren't calculating now. They were warmer, curious in a different way. "You know," he said, sitting back against the wall, "you're not what I expected." "Neither are you." This settled again. Not awkward, just thoughtful. He looked around at the half-lit lab, the echo of life beginning to hum in the corners, and realized something strange. He didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not while this place still had breath left in it. Not while she was looking at him like that. The AI core was slower to awaken than Derek expected. Even with the relay stabilized and the energy routes patched, it refused to engage beyond the most basic of subroutines. He ran diagnostics 3 times, each result showing corrupted memory sectors and degraded decision matrices. Whatever original intelligence the Velary had programmed into their ARC's neural systems had long since broken down under entropy and time. The interface flickered with fragmented glyphs, pulses of color that hinted at ancient logic, spiraling just out of reach. Derek sat in front of it with his sleeves rolled up, grease on his fingers, and a toolkit open beside him. Leenora hovered nearby, not crowding, just present. It struck him how quickly she'd learned to step into his rhythm. She didn't question his decisions or second-guess his packing. She watched, absorbed, then mirrored. He leaned back, sighing. The AI's shot might be able to scrape some cached data if I link it to an external processor, but I'd have to isolate the corrupted strands manually. "Can you?" she asked, stepping closer. "Maybe, but it won't be quick. This thing's operating on a logic language I barely understand. Your people coded on emotion harmonic pairing models, intuitive programming." She smiled faintly, sitting beside him now. "It was how we designed everything, not just function, but meaning. Every system on this arc responds not just to data, but intent." Derek looked over, browsed drawn. "You mean emotion literally influences the tech? To a degree, it was our safeguard against cold misuse. You can't activate nursery protocols if your heart's full of violence. You can't enter sanctuary sectors with thoughts of betrayal. We believed in aligning purpose with purpose." He shook his head slowly, impressed. "It's not just brilliant. That's humane." "It was," she said, voice softer now, "until others decided we were dangerous for it." He didn't reply. The silence held weight, but not awkwardness. There was a comfort in working beside her, even when they weren't speaking. He returned to the AI core, began soldering a bypass into a neutral interface bridge, using his ship's backup AI unit as a temporary filter. As the arc ignited and the feeds lit up, streams of half-coherent logs scrolled across the screen. Derek read quickly, filtering out code debris, zeroing in on specific terms, genetic sequence locks, biometric pairing keys, embryonic maturation cues. But one log in particular caught his eye. It wasn't a system message. It was a command line initiated by a Velary Council leader during the final transmission before stasis. The entry was labeled, "Fail-safe repopulation directive, override authorized." "What's this?" he muttered, pulling up the command set. Leenora leaned over his shoulder, her breath warm near his neck as she scanned the code. Her eyes narrowed. "That's not standard. I never authorized a repopulation override." "Then someone else did." He pointed at the signature. "Looks like your geneticist. The one who built the keystone pairing algorithm. He set a fallback trigger in case your selection failed." Her posture shifted subtly, not alarmed but tense. "What did the override do?" Derek hesitated before answering. If no compatible mate was found within 2 decades, the system would begin artificial reproduction using isolated strands of your genome crossed with stored donor backups. No emotional pairing, just replication. She drew in a breath through her nose, sharp and quiet. They were going to force clones. It would have erased your people's philosophy in 1 generation. She didn't speak for a while. When she did, her voice was lower. He must have feared extinction more than legacy. Derek let her sit with the thought. Then slowly, he closed the file and isolated the trigger. "It's dormant now, but if I'd pulled the wrong lever, if the wrong scavenger came here instead of me, your arc would be churning out a generation of soulless copies by now." Leenora turned her gaze on him, and for the first time since they met, she looked vulnerable. "That's not what we were meant to be. We weren't just trying to preserve our bodies. We were trying to preserve how we chose to live." He met her stare without flinching. "Then let's make sure that choice stays yours." They worked through the rest of the cycle in sync, scrubbing traces of the override and replacing it with a secure lock, one tied to her biometric code and one tied to his if he chose to stay. It was a gesture, not a contract, a way to tell the system this was a partnership or nothing. He didn't need to say it out loud. She understood. At night, if time aboard the Ark could still be measured in nights, Derek returned to the small crew quarters Leenora had retrofitted for him. It was sparse but clean, lit by the soft biolights that pulsed like slow-breathing lungs. He washed, changed, and sat on the edge of the makeshift bed. The quiet was thicker here. No hum of the AI, no chatter from shipboard systems, just him alone with his thoughts. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, that he was growing attached, or that he wasn't disturbed at all. She wasn't just another alien. She wasn't an assignment or a historical curiosity, or even a tragic relic of a war humanity had forgotten. She was a person, flawed, brilliant, sometimes too blunt and occasionally amused by things he didn't understand, but real. And she was choosing him, not demanding, not coercing, just choosing. There was a knock, a soft sound barely audible. The door hissed open and she stepped inside without waiting for permission. She held a glass vial in one hand, filled with a glowing blue liquid. "This is what our ancestors called the first dream," she said quietly. It was a ritual passed between those who intended to bond, not a drug, a memory blend, one that links experiences without forcing intimacy. "I thought you might want to see what the Velary were before all this." He studied her face, her posture. She wasn't offering a seduction. She was offering history, connection, trust. He reached out and took the vial without a word. Her fingers lingered briefly on his, warm, calloused, steady. Then she nodded and turned to leave. "You don't have to rush," he said, before she reached the door. "I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." She paused, then turned just slightly, enough to meet his gaze over her shoulder. "I know." The door closed and Derek sat there holding a glowing piece of memory in his hand, feeling like he'd just been handed more than a history lesson. He'd been handed a future that hadn't been written yet, and one he might actually want to be part of. Derek didn't sleep that night, not because he couldn't, but because something in him had shifted, something subtle yet undeniable. The vial glowed softly in the dimmed lights of his quarters, its liquid pooling in rhythm with the beat of the ship, or maybe it was his own pulse that had synchronized with the Ark's heartbeat. He turned the vial in his fingers, watching the light swirl, remembering Leen or his words, the first dream. Not a euphemism, not a trap, not a seduction. A legacy. He didn't need to be told how rare it was for someone like her to offer that kind of access. This wasn't a cultural gesture thrown out casually. It was weighty, intimate in a way words couldn't be. He opened it, inhaled the scent sweet and electric like rain on ozone, and drank. The effect wasn't immediate. There was no rush, no blackout, no surreal spiral, just a deepening of stillness. A slow drop into something vast and old and echoing. And then the memories began. He wasn't in his body, not entirely. He could still feel the pressure of the cot beneath him, the faint thrum of life support through the floor, but layered over that was something else, a gentle thread of consciousness unraveling. He stood on a hill beneath a violet sky filled with floating islands and twin moons. The wind brushed against him in a language he couldn't understand, but the emotion came through clearly. Joy, community, purpose. The world before him teemed with bioluminescent life, flowing across fields of glassy grass and trees, with roots that curled in slow, deliberate rhythms. And then he was no longer just seeing it, he was living it. Not as Derek, but through the eyes of someone else. A child racing through narrow stone corridors, hand in hand with siblings who laughed in strange tones. A student kneeling in front of a genetic loom, weaving strands of light into a living code. A woman, Leenora, standing at the base of a great spire, her face streaked with tears as she watched ships leave the atmosphere, carrying the last of the children to distant safe zones. It wasn't a narrative, it was emotion layered on memory. There were no clean explanations, just sensations and context delivered through instinct. He felt what it meant to love someone enough to sleep for centuries just to keep their chance alive. He felt the weight of solitude, not as silence, but as the absence of minds that once sang in harmony around her, and more than anything, he felt the conviction of the Velary that survival was meaningless without the preservation of what made them who they were. By the time the dream began to fade, he was on his knees shaking the vial long empty beside him. It wasn't just memory, it was burden, and it was Leenora alone anymore. She had shared it with him, and now it lived in his mind too, stitched into him with quiet grace. He got up, ran cold water over his face, and stared at his reflection in the polished metal panel above the sink. The man looking back at him was the same, but his eyes were different, not just older, clearer. He understood now that this wasn't about being chosen, it was about being trusted, and he didn't want to take that lightly. He headed straight for the core room. Leenora was already there, standing barefoot in the dark beside the greenhouse pod. The lights from the cultivation units bathed her skin in gold and green hues, her glowing freckles blinking in slow, steady rhythm. She turned as he approached, but didn't speak. "I saw it," he said quietly. "All of it. Not the way I expected, but I saw." She nodded once. "Do you understand now?" He crossed his arms, standing near but not quite touching. "I don't think I'll ever fully understand what it was like, but I get the shape of it. What you lost, what you're trying to keep alive. And do you think it's worth saving?" He looked at her. Not the otherworldly frame, not the exotic beauty, just her. The stubborn, sharp-edged, brilliant survivor who stood alone at the edge of extinction and still believed in hope. "Yes," he said. "I do." Her shoulders lowered slightly, not quite a sigh, but something close. Relief. Maybe even a hint of gratitude she didn't want to admit. She walked over to one of the suspended stasis pods and keyed in a code. Inside soft blue light illuminated several glowing embryo canisters, each with a faint pulse of life. "These are the last viable cross hybrids. They need calibration. The base genome is mine." The supplement code was originally pulled from Velary databanks. Now it's unstable. That's why the RC searched for a compatible host, someone with the right sequences to stabilize the mutations. "You want to graft my DNA into the mix," Derek said, not flinching. "That's what this is really about." "Yes," she said, "but not the way you're thinking. The process requires emotional calibration, neural syncing. The ARC won't allow artificial grafting unless it senses true cohesion." "You mean the system needs us to fall in love," he said dryly. Nora tilted her head, not love, alignment, though those sometimes overlap. He chuckled despite himself. "You have a talent for understatement. I'm trying not to frighten you." He looked her dead in the eye. "You're not." They fell into silence again, and this time it was easier, familiar. She moved to the greenhouse control panel and began adjusting nutrient outputs. He joined her, checking the power readouts, confirming heat distribution. The work flowed naturally between them, no need for instructions. That rhythm, cooperation without complication, was rare, especially with strangers, especially across species. But with her, it felt earned. "I ran into something in the logs," he said as they worked. "There's a subroutine trying to corrupt the embryo data, subtle, masked under routine recalibrations." Her hands paused. That wasn't part of the override protocol. "I know, this is different. It's external, inserted through a maintenance channel. I think something tried to sabotage the ARC after the override was set." She stiffened. Another human. He nodded grimly, or something that was programmed by one. "I can't confirm yet, but I think we're not alone on this ship." Arx's fingers hovered over the interface, eyes locked onto the scrolling diagnostic readout, watching the faint flickers of corrupted code repeat themselves at timed intervals. The subroutine was subtle, almost elegant. It buried itself in routine calibration pulses and camouflaged its actions by mimicking Leenora's own override patterns. It was smart, too smart to be random degradation. This was artificial sabotage, hidden in the maintenance protocols of the ARC's embryo sequencing systems. And it was recent. Within the last 10 cycles, by his estimate, that meant whatever had injected it was either still active on the ARC or left something behind that was. He backed out of the interface and turned sharply to Leenora, who had already stepped closer, her expression unreadable but tense. "If you had any surveillance nodes still working," he said, voice low, "now's the time to check them." "I shut most of them down years ago," she answered, her voice matching his tone. "After the override protocols activated, I didn't trust what they were linked to, but some corridors near the data vault still run on isolated power." "Show me." She moved to the wall, placed her palm on a smooth hexagonal panel, and after a biometric scan the room shifted. Part of the floor recessed slightly and rose again to reveal a compact console. When she keyed in the access code, several grainy video feeds flickered into view: dead halls, storage pods, silent maintenance bays. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then Derek pointed at one of the lower quadrants. A shadow moved, not just a flicker. Movement, too deliberate for malfunction. They crawled across the floor, clinging low to the wall, avoiding every light source, humanoid in shape but off, like something built to mimic a body but not inhabit one. Lean or a stiffened, that's not from this arc. Yeah, I kind of guessed that. Derek's mind went into overdrive. There were theories among scavengers, rumors of post-war cleanup drones, autonomous units left behind to wipe traces of unauthorized tech after conflicts. Supposedly, they were programmed by factions within the coalition that didn't want certain technologies falling into rogue hands. Most thought those things were just ghost stories. But the crawling thing on the screen looked like a nightmare made of metal and plastic, with a scanning eye that pulsed red every few seconds as it slithered into one of the nearby server cores. "How long has that thing been here?" he asked, already grabbing his toolkit. "I don't know," she said, eyes following it. "But if it accessed the gene vaults, it may have already tampered with more than we've seen. I'm going after it." "You're not going alone," she said instantly. "I'm faster alone." "You're also squishier," she replied, deadpan. "I have claws and better eyes in the dark. I'll go first." For a second, Derek almost laughed, but she wasn't wrong. And this wasn't the time for pride. He nodded and followed her into the corridor, both of them moving quickly but quietly. The lights above flickered faintly as they passed, no more than emergency illumination, and the hum of nearby systems gave way to long, eerie silences. Leenora led the way through a narrow maintenance shaft that bypassed the main path to the data vaults. The air was thick with age and ozone. The arc groaned around them like a sleeping beast, every creak a reminder of its fragile condition. As they approached the server wing, the temperature dropped noticeably. That wasn't right. The AI hub's heat regulation should have prevented any local cold spots. Derek paused, held up a hand. Leenora froze mid-step. He crouched near the wall and scanned with a portable field reader, magnetic distortion. Something was draining energy actively. They rounded a corner, and there it was. The drone stood up right now, its frame gaunt and angular, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were jointed in reverse, and its chest cavity pulsed with an inner core of blue light. The single red eye swiveled toward them as it reached into an open server panel, its fingers reshaping into fine tools. It didn't react with surprise, it simply froze, assessing them. "Unregistered life forms detected," it said in a mechanical tone. "Human asset present," Velary genetic source confirmed. "Protocol, terminate anomaly." It moved fast, too fast. Derek rolled left as a beam of light scorched the wall behind him. Leenora lunged, claws flashing, slashing through the drone's forearm before it could fire again. Sparks sprayed the corridor. Derek didn't hesitate. He pulled a plasma arc from his kit, activated the iron blade, and drove it into the drone's exposed torso plate. The thing screeched in a sound that was more frequency than voice, and then collapsed, twitching violently as its systems failed. Derek stepped back, panting, watching the lights in its eye fade. Leenora crouched over it, breathing heavily but unharmed. That was no scavenger drone. "It was coalition tech either," Derek added. "It's newer, adaptive. This was built specifically to kill you." She stood slowly, then someone knew I was still alive. And they didn't just send a signal, they sent hardware. He scanned the wreck again. Embedded in its chest was a hard-coded beacon, not wireless optical short-range burst relay. Whoever sent it wanted minimal traceability, but he could still pull fragments. As he connected his interface and began to decrypt, several lines of code jumped out. Coordinates, directives, DNA suppression keys. One phrase, however, made his stomach turn: termination order, genetic heresy. Leenora read it over his shoulder and said nothing. Her silence wasn't shock, it was fury tempered by restraint. They called my existence heresy. They were afraid of what your people could do if you survived, and they're still afraid, which means we still matter. He looked up at her. We need to scrub this ship clean, not just physically, system-wise. You have no idea how many backdoors could be buried in your core systems. This whole place could be compromised. Then we start at the beginning, she said, together. He nodded, the fire in his chest, matching hers now. Not just protection, not just preservation. This wasn't about staying alive anymore. This was about fighting back. Derek didn't stop working for the next 20 hours. Not to eat, not to rest. Not even when his hands started to cramp from the constant rewiring. The sabotage had reached deeper than either of them expected. The drone's attack was only one piece of a broader infestation, an embedded kill code seeded into backup data logs, masked as harmless redundancies. Every system tied to the Ark's embryo storage or neural calibration process had been touched. Derek had found corrupted headers with sub-directives designed to initiate cascading failures once a cross-species bonding protocol had begun. The implication was clear. Someone had expected Leenora to survive, and had planned for the possibility of her succeeding in her mission. They wanted to let her try, and fail catastrophically. He worked with quiet fury, tracing lines of infected code like tracking veins of rot through ancient stone. Across the room, Leenora moved with equal focus, combing through her people's neural templates, purging the infection strand by strand. The console's interface responded to her presence differently than it did his, reactive lights shifting to meet her hands, audio tones adjusting pitch to match her emotional state. Derek had never seen a system so tightly bound to its user. She wasn't just operating it, she was a part of it. And yet she never once made him feel like an outsider. She consulted him, explained the old coding principles when needed, listened to his suggestions without ego. There were no power plays between them, just trust. Mutual trust built on necessity and shaped by growing understanding. He didn't have to ask if she respected him. He could feel it every time she glanced his way with those sharp, thoughtful eyes. Not just curiosity anymore, not calculation, just presence. Sometime deep into the cycle, he stopped and leaned back from the panel, shoulders aching. That's the last of the sabotage in this cluster. I've isolated the rest behind a firewall that's not network-facing. If anything else tries to trip it, we'll get a burst alarm before any damage. Nora nodded but didn't speak. She was staring at a visualized neural stream, one of the embryo thought matrix development feeds. The lines had been jagged before, flickering from instability. Now they pulsed smooth and clean, the beginnings of real coherence. The embryo wasn't just viable, it was stable. That meant something fundamental had been repaired, something essential to her species' future. When she finally looked away from the data, her expression wasn't triumphant. It was calm. It was resolved. "You saved the children," she said softly, and it hit harder than he expected. He stood up, stretched his arms behind his back, and gave her a crooked smile. I'd like to say it was for heroism or some noble sense of purpose, but honestly, I just didn't want to let them win. "That's reason enough," she said, and this time there was a small smile, subtle but unmistakably warm. "Still, you chose this, not many would." He looked at her for a long moment. "You say that like I'm doing something extraordinary." "You are," she said. "Not because you saved us, but because you stayed. Even after knowing what this place holds, what I am." "What you are," he repeated, stepping closer. You mean someone brilliant, scarred, stubborn as hell, and carrying the weight of an entire civilization on her back without falling apart. She tilted her head slightly, amused. You forgot arrogant. I figured that came standard. For a few seconds there was nothing but quiet, not silence, just a peaceful hush as the arc systems hummed around them, the pulse of the embryos, the glow of the nutrient chambers. All of it suddenly felt like background noise compared to the look in her eyes. Why did you come here? She asked, not accusing, just curious. He hesitated, then shrugged. I was running from something, I guess. The salvaged life is half adventure, half escape. You don't stay in one place too long. You don't get attached. I thought the only thing I was good for was pulling scraps from the bones of old wars. And now? Now I'm thinking maybe it's time I built something instead. Leenora reached up and touched the console beside her. The lights dimmed slightly, shifting to a lower tone, more intimate. You said once that you weren't afraid of me. Why? Because you didn't try to impress me. You didn't pretend to be anything other than what you are. That takes guts, especially when everyone who knew you was gone. And you didn't flinch when I told you what I wanted. No, he said. You didn't demand it. You asked. That matters. She stepped toward him. Then, close enough that he could see the faint glow of the freckles on her collarbone, the soft rise and fall of her breath. She didn't touch him. She just stood there, watching him with quiet certainty. The calibration sequence is almost ready, she said. The arc will need us to sync emotionally before it allows embryo gestation to proceed. It's more than just trust. It's connection. Willing connection. Derek didn't break eye contact. Are you asking me if I want this? I'm asking if you feel what I feel, if this isn't just proximity and pressure, if beneath all of this there's something real. He thought about all the moments since they met. The first time she scanned him, the way she offered the first dream, the way she fought beside him in the server wing, how she never once treated him like a tool or a threat. And then he reached out and gently took her hand. Her fingers wrapped around his, strong and warm, no hesitation. I'm not running, he said. Not from you, not from this. So yeah, it's real. The system behind them chirped softly, lights blooming across the main console. The arc had accepted the sync. The calibration had begun, but neither of them moved to watch. They just stood there, hand in hand, surrounded by glowing lights and the quiet rhythm of something ancient coming back to life, not through force, not through fear, but through choice. The calibration sequence had begun hours ago, but neither of them left the chamber, not because the system required their presence. It didn't, not directly, but because neither wanted to be apart while something so crucial unfolded. They stood in the center of the Ark's central biospire, a chamber once reserved for Velary ceremonial initiations, now reactivated after decades of silence. The walls pulsed with soft color shifts, amber, violet, and silver reacting subtly to their synced biosignatures. In the center of the room, the embryos floated in nutrient chambers, now stabilizing with an almost meditative pulse. Derek watched the rhythm like it was the beat of some living heart. Not just science, not just data, a future being born quietly and deliberately. Leenora sat beside one of the consoles, legs folded beneath her, her gaze focused but peaceful. Her posture had shifted in recent days. She still carried the same strength, the same sharp presence, but it was tempered now with something gentler, like a storm that had found calm after the worst of its winds had passed. She was letting her guard down more often, laughing even, not loudly but genuinely. Derek hadn't realized how often she'd been holding herself together until she no longer had to. They had fought side by side, worked through sabotage and survived a drone meant to erase her. Now, in the stillness that followed, the weight between them had changed. It wasn't just shared responsibility, it was a bond, and neither of them denied it anymore. I used to sit here as a child, she said softly, not looking at him. We'd listened to the song of intention, a harmonic resonance programmed into the ark's walls. It's silent now. Why, he asked, shifting beside her. Because it only plays when there is balance, not just structural but emotional. It was our people's way of honoring alignment between purpose and action. She looked up at him then, her expression unreadable but heavy with implication. The Ark is trying to decide if it should play again. Derek raised a brow, so we're being judged by an ancient sound system. Not judged, she said. Understood. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, letting the weight of that sink in. It didn't scare him, not really, but it made everything more present, more real. You think it'll approve? She didn't smile, but her eyes held a flicker of amusement. You're still here, aren't you? That was the part he kept coming back to, the decision not to leave. The realization that the life he thought he was drifting through, without anchors, without permanence, had finally found something worth rooting into. Not because it was expected or because he had nowhere else to go, but because she made him want to stay. She didn't ask for everything. She didn't demand blind commitment or unrealistic declarations. She simply offered the chance to build something new together. And now here they were, two species at the brink of memory, defying extinction through sheer will and cooperation. Suddenly the lights flickered, not the usual soft pulse of shifting energy, but a sharp blink like a skipped heartbeat. Derek rose instantly, already checking the nearby diagnostic console. A red error flashed in the lower right. Sector 7B, Resource Archive Integrity Breach. Leenora was already standing. That's the memory chamber. The cultural data stream? Derek asked, already pulling tools from the pouch at his waist. She nodded grimly. It houses the personalities and ancestral recordings, the entire emotional lineage we use to raise the first generations. If that goes down, our children will be born without context, without guidance. He didn't wait for more. Together they ran through the corridor, the walls glowing dimmer with each passing second. When they reached the chamber, they found the outer door still sealed, but heat signatures showed movement inside, not from drones. Organic. Derek hesitated only for a moment before manually bypassing the lock and stepping into the low-lit room. It wasn't what he expected. Inside stood a figure humanoid wrapped in a polymer cloak, its back turned. The moment they entered, it spun and Derek saw the face. Human, pale, eyes blank, a breathing mask over the mouth, tubes feeding down into a pack at the figure's waist. But something was wrong. Too fluid, too quiet. It didn't speak. Just watched them with a gaze that didn't blink. When Nora stepped forward, that's not a person. It's synthetic. Derek scanned quickly. She was right. Organic shell but internal structure full of wiring and a hollowed core. Another kind of infiltration unit cloaked to resemble human physiology. But why? Then the figure raised a hand and a deep pulse hit the chamber. A directed electromagnetic burst perfectly tuned. Consoles blinked. Memory cores sizzled. The lights went red. EMP disruptor, Derek growled. She's targeting the memory banks directly. He surged forward, but the synthetic moved faster, slamming him back with unexpected strength. He hit the floor hard. Before it could advance, Leenora was already there, slashing with the same fierce precision she'd used against the last drone. She didn't hesitate. She didn't hold back. The synthetic staggered sparks flying from its neck as she drove her claws deep into the processor housing. Derek rolled to his feet, grabbed his plasma arc, and ignited the blade. With a precise, clean sweep, he severed the figure at the knees. It fell twitching, voice modules sparking with nonsense syllables. Together they tore the rest apart, and silence finally returned. He rushed to the memory core and connected his reader, fingers flying across the keys. The core had been damaged, but not lost. He began isolating the ruptured sectors, rerouting power, sealing off the worst-hit areas. Leenora watched, breathing hard. "Can it be saved?" "I think so," he said, gritting his teeth. "But it's close." Minutes passed, data lines flickered. Then finally the hum of the archive returned, weak but steady. A voice, Velary, feminine, gentle, echoed from the walls, reciting a childhood song in slow, harmonious syllables. The Ark's memory had survived. Leenora knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder. "You're not just rebuilding systems. You're rebuilding my people's soul." He looked at her, breathing hard. "No, we are." The archive core stabilized, but only just. Derek remained at the terminal long after the synthetic intruder was dismantled and the room cleared. A part of him didn't want to let go, not because he doubted the system could hold itself together, but because he couldn't stop thinking about how close they'd come to losing everything. Again, the recovery algorithms were running, purging fragmented memories, resequencing lost narrative strands, but there would be holes. Echoes that wouldn't sing right. All chapters of Leenora's cultural history now depended on a patchwork of restored code and what little he and she could remember. They could move forward, but it wouldn't be perfect, and maybe that was the part that burned most. Leenora stood behind him, quiet but watchful. She hadn't spoken in minutes. Her eyes remained fixed on the terminal, on the slowly rebuilding structure of the Velary memory web. He couldn't imagine what she must have been feeling, witnessing the near erasure of the very voices that had raised her, loved her, shaped her into who she was. These weren't just historical entries. They were personalities. Personalities who once guided her people like extended family, passed down through encoded wisdom and neural impressions. And now, because of someone else's fear, so many of them had been silenced. "It'll hold," Derek said, voice low but steady. "We lost some parts, but most of the foundational framework is still intact. The embryos will still have guidance." "It won't be the same," she replied. "No, but maybe it doesn't need to be." She looked at him then, eyebrows raised, not challenging, just curious. "I mean," he continued, "you're still here. I'm here. You're not raising them alone anymore. Maybe they don't need every voice from the past. Maybe they just need one good one in the present." Her posture softened just slightly. Her eyes were still rimmed with the tension of what they'd nearly lost, but she nodded slowly. "Then we owe it to them to be strong, to give them something real to build from. We already are." A long breath left her lips as she turned back to the dimmed glow of the archive wall. The gentle, melodic hum of recovered data pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat struggling to find rhythm again. She walked forward and placed her hand on the glass, her bioluminescent freckles glowing brighter as the panel responded. For a moment, the chamber dimmed, and the soft, ancient voice resumed its lullaby from earlier, tentative but alive. She stood there with her eyes closed, absorbing the sound like light on her skin. Then, without a word, she turned, walked back to Derek, and held out her hand. He didn't ask where she was taking him. They moved together through the corridor, footsteps echoing lightly down the restored hallways. The arc was brighter now, in subtle ways. The light strips more responsive, the ambient hum of systems steadier, like the ship itself had started to believe in its own recovery. Leenora led him down into the habitat wing, the zone where environmental testing had once taken place. It had been locked down since the day he arrived, sealed while they focused on survival. But now the doors slid open at her touch, revealing a massive, domed chamber full of overgrown flora and wild energy. A jungle bloomed here, carefully managed chaos. Velary plant life infused with bioluminescent traits, vines that curled with sensory intelligence, trees that shimmered as they responded to movement. The air was warm, dense, fragrant, and alive. Derek stopped walking as soon as they stepped inside, struck silent by the richness of it all. This wasn't just a biosphere, it was a cathedral, a place where life itself was honored and nurtured. "I grew up here," she said quietly beside him. "This is where I was taught how to feel the world, not just walk through it." Derek glanced over at her, and something shifted in the air between them. No weight, no pressure, just awareness. She stepped away, down a short slope toward a raised stone platform covered in moss and light. Without looking back, she said, "You fought for this place, for them, for me, and I never said what that meant. You didn't have to. I want to." He followed her, heart beating fast but steady, not from nerves, but from a deep, grounding certainty that he couldn't remember ever feeling before. He waited until he was beside her, then turned to face him fully. "I was prepared to rebuild my species through necessity," she said, voice low and unwavering. "I was ready to treat it like duty, survival, but you changed that. You made it about choice, about trust, about something warmer." He didn't speak. He just looked at her, really looked with everything he had. "I don't want to create life just because I'm the last. I want to build it with someone who sees me, all of me, who doesn't treat me like a symbol or a relic." "You're not either," Derek said. "You're a woman who made a hard promise and kept it even when everything fell apart. I'd be proud to help build something with you, not because I have to, because I want to." Her eyes searched his for a long time. Then she stepped closer and placed her hand over his chest. "Then I want to show you what Velary bonding really means." He didn't hesitate. They stood in the center of the jungle cathedral, surrounded by shimmering trees, in the quiet thrum of reawakening systems, and there, without ceremony or command, she leaned in and kissed him. Slow, unhurried, there was no fire behind it, no desperation, only truth, connection, the kind of moment that didn't demand a future but quietly promised one. The ark responded instantly. The ambient lights shifted. The walls vibrated faintly. A harmonic pulse, low and rising, moved through the structure like the beginning of a song not played in 1,000 years. Derek looked around as biolights flared and Leenora smiled softly. "It's playing again," she whispered. The song of intention, the ark recognizes the bond. And for once in a life that had been nothing but drifting from wreck to wreck, Derek realized he had arrived, not at a place, but at a person, at a future. The ark changed after that night, not just in function, but in feeling. Derek couldn't quite explain it, but everything around him began to feel more coherent, more alive. Once opened a fraction of a second faster, systems responded more intuitively. The lights brightened slightly in every room he entered. The ship recognized him now, not as an intruder or outsider, but as part of its design, an accepted variable in the new equation for survival. He hadn't expected that kind of shift. He'd imagined helping Leenora would mean hard work, patience, maybe sacrifice. He hadn't imagined the ship itself would adapt to him like a living organism welcoming new blood. It was Leenora who confirmed it during one of their routine diagnostics. "You're part of the ark now. It knows you. You're imprinted in the biosystems as an emotional key." He glanced over from where he was rerouting a cooling relay. "That sounds uncomfortably close to being a cog in a machine." "You're not a cog," she replied without missing a beat. "You're the missing half of a system designed for two." That was how she saw him now, not as a human visitor, not as a reluctant participant, but as her partner. Not just romantically, not just genetically, but as an equal in purpose. And Derek found himself embracing that role more easily than he expected. The responsibilities were enormous: life support calibrations, genetic batch sequencing, memory archive curation. But the weight didn't crush him, it grounded him. Every time he touched a console or adjusted a data stream, he knew why he was doing it. He wasn't wandering anymore. He had something to protect, someone. The first viable embryo completed its growth phase 3 days later. It floated in a translucent biopod, its tiny body curled in on itself, skin not quite violet but somewhere between his and hers. The lights inside the pod pulsed with measured calm. Derek stood in front of it, heart hammering against his ribs, as he stared at the life they had made know were making. It was too soon to call it a child, but it was more than potential. It was proof that something had survived the worst, that something beautiful had come from grief, resistance, and choice. Leenora stood beside him, her face unreadable for a moment. Then she exhaled slowly and her fingers reached out to press against the glass. "This is the first," she said, "but not the last." Derek nodded slowly, unable to speak for a second. "What will we call them?" She glanced at him, smiling faintly. "We wait until after the dream phase. Names are chosen by the child's resonant emotion. Of course, he muttered. Velary logic. You'll learn to love it. I already do. The moment felt warm, solid, complete in a way few moments in his life ever had, but it didn't last. An alert blinked red on the console beside the pod. Derek turned instantly, instincts taking over. The message was a direct relay ping, tight bandwidth, encrypted, external. A signal was being broadcast from the Ark. He tapped into it, tracing the source. Not the memory vaults, not the AI core, the comms satellite array near the top of the ship, the one they'd never bothered to reconnect. It had activated itself. More accurately, something had triggered it remotely. "We've been pinged," he said sharply. "Someone found us. Me nor A stepped forward, already scanning. Is it a distress signal? No, it's a location beacon, and it's on a military relay band." Her face tightened. "They're coming." Derek's jaw clenched. "We shut down the drone, cleaned out the override code, rebooted the AI in safe mode. This shouldn't be possible. They must have embedded a secondary beacon, passive, buried until a live embryo was detected." He looked over at the pod again. The moment we succeeded, it told them. The room went cold despite the temperature controls. The idea of losing this place, losing them after coming so far, it sparked something in Derek that was sharper than fear. It was fury, not wild, not chaotic, focused. "We can't run," he said. "This isn't a ship that can jump. We're not fighters, and we're out in deep space with no allies." Leenora nodded slowly. "Then we make sure we're not easy prey." They moved fast after that. Defensive routines were activated, what few the Ark still had. Derek rerouted power to shield arrays and disabled every external comm link. Leenora accessed the old cloaking array, a partial phase shift generator that had been mothballed after too many core failures. Together, they pushed the systems harder than they were meant to go, reinforcing corridors, mapping fallback zones, building traps from repurposed drone parts. They weren't building a fortress, they were building a last stand. Hours passed, then the sensor array lit up. One ship, sleek small, armed with plasma-linked tethers and a forward-mounted EMP coil. In Black Op's design, Derek recognized the build. He'd seen the wrecks before, silent ships with no insignias, no flight record, no names, just hammers disguised as scalpels. "They're not here to negotiate," he said. "No," she replied. "They're here to erase." He looked at her then. She was calm, but there was something behind her eyes, determination so intense it bordered on terrifying. She didn't fear death. She feared failure, and that made her dangerous in the best possible way. "If we don't make it," he said, "someone else needs to know this place existed, that you existed." "We will make it," she said simply. The ship drew closer. The outer perimeter sensors flared. The next few minutes would decide everything. But for Derek, there was only one thing he needed to say in case they didn't get another chance. "I love you." He looked at him, and this time she did smile. Fully. No hesitation. "I know." The Black Ops ship pierced the upper range of the Ark's gravity buffer like a silent dagger, drifting slow and deliberate as though it already knew its prey was cornered. No hail, no demand, just presence. That was how coalition cleanup teams worked when something had been declared a genetic hazard. They didn't negotiate, didn't announce. They arrived and erased. Derek stood in the command chamber beside Leenora, watching the trajectory feeds, already calculating burn vectors, shield rotations, emergency fallback paths, every possible move that wouldn't end in destruction. There weren't many. The Ark wasn't built for combat. It was built for life. And now, to protect it, he would have to do what the ones who built it never could: fight. He tapped into the outer comms relay not to speak, but to listen. The enemy ship's data stream was encrypted, but some patterns were universal. It was scanning the Ark for biological movement, focusing on heat signatures. It had already marked the embryo chamber. The only place it hadn't yet noticed was the AI vault, long considered dead after the first sabotage. That gave Derek an idea, not a perfect one, not even a good one, but a desperate, functional idea. He turned to Leenora, who had already stepped away from the console and was examining the archive interface, her claws twitching lightly at her sides. "We need to bait them into thinking we're vulnerable," Derek said. "Draw them into a section where they'll commit, then lock it down." "You want to trap them inside the Ark?" she replied, meeting his eyes. "Risky. If they breach the wrong corridor, we lose oxygen in half the habitat ring." "I'm not saying we blow it, just seal it. Hard vacuum, cut power, isolate, then fry whatever's on board with a static pulse. The power's unstable enough that it'll look like reactor leakage." She nodded once. It could work. "They're not expecting resistance," he said. "They think this place is a relic. They're not prepared for a woman who won't let her future die without a fight." She tilted her head slightly, and a man who decided to stay when he didn't have to. Together they moved. The plan came together in minutes. Leenora initiated a manual power bleed in the life support controls for the engineering bay, drawing attention to a section of the Ark they had already emptied. Derek rerouted reactor output to create artificial heat spikes, mimicking panic evacuation routes. It didn't take long. The enemy vessel latched on with magnetic tethers and drilled through the weakest hull section like a parasite. Inside came the soldiers, 3 of them, faceless in their matte black armor, rifles drawn, sensors glowing as they swept the corridors. Derek tracked them from the command room, waiting until the last possible moment. "Now," he said. "Lean," Nora slammed the seal protocol. Every door between the intruders and the rest of the Ark locked with a magnetic scream, followed by a decompression purge. The section went cold and silent in an instant. Then Derek hit the static burst, one designed to short out implants, neural comms, and onboard electronics. The feed cut off. The soldiers never made it to the embryo chamber. They never even knew who stopped them. But the Coalition ship was still outside. Never Derek could react a second time. "I'll take a suit. They'll shoot you down or no." A slow energy siphon began draining the Ark systems. The lights dimmed. The embryo chamber flickered. The AI began to shudder. If it continued, they'd lose everything. Derek turned to Leenora, heart pounding. "We have to sever the connection manually. I can do it, but I need to EVA out there. Cut the line directly." "You'll be exposed," she said. "I'll take a suit. They'll shoot you down. Not if they're not expecting me." She moved toward him, caught his wrist before he could grab the suit. "If you do this, you might not come back. If I don't, none of us do." For a moment she said nothing. Then she pulled him in and kissed him firm, fierce, without hesitation. "Then come back to me," she whispered. "No excuses." He nodded and moved fast. The EVA rig wasn't meant for combat, but it would hold up in vacuum. He launched from the emergency chute, body twisting in 0G, as the distant hull of the Coalition vessel loomed like a black sun. The tether was bright silver against the void, pooling with stolen power. He reached it fast, anchored himself, and activated the arc torch. Sparks flew. The tether resisted. The ship noticed. A turret emerged from the belly. He didn't think. He dropped low, twisting hard, using the tether itself as cover. The arc blade flared again, slicing halfway through. One last push. The turret fired, but not fast enough. The blade finished the cut. The tether snapped. The power drain stopped. The ship reeled, lost its grip, and began to drift. Derek tumbled into darkness. He awoke in the med bay, breath shallow, suit blackened. Nora sat beside him, her fingers gripping his hand tightly, eyes closed as if praying, not to a god but to whatever part of him was still tethered to her. When he stirred, her eyes snapped open. He tried to speak, but she shook her head. "You did it," she said. "They're gone. The Ark is safe. The embryo is safe." He tried to smile, but it came out weak and crooked. "Told you I'd come back." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. "You're not allowed to leave me. Not now. Not ever." Wasn't planning on it. They stayed like that forehead to forehead as the Ark's system slowly returned to full strength around them. The lights brightened, the AI core hummed, and the soft pulse of the embryo chamber signaled life steady and strong. Weeks passed. The Coalition ship never returned. The ark went deeper into the Perseid zone, cloaked, hidden. Derek and Leenora completed the first gestation cycle. The child born was strong, curious, with violet-hued skin and wide human eyes. They named her Nera after an old Velary word meaning hope given form. They built a future. Together, not as symbols, not as survivors, but as partners, human and Velary, who chose love over extinction and never looked back.